Welcome everyone. This is Deborah Dudak with the Illinois State Historical Society, and this is our January History Happy Hour with Tina Beaird. Tina is joining us from Tamarack Genealogy. She's also an amazing librarian at the Plainfield Public Library in Plainfield, Illinois. And today she's giving an absolutely fantastic lecture about the pandemic. It's just simply called Pandemic 1918. But as Tina will show you, this is something that's very, very unique, which breaks down a lot of information about the influenza pandemic of 1917 to 1920 with a very specific case studies on Illinois, which is something that you won't see on some of the PBS programs. You won't be seeing that in your news feed when people start talking about the flu pandemic of years past. This is a really fantastic program. I hope you really enjoy it. Remember that you, at any time as you're watching this as a recording, please contact Tina if you have any questions. She'd love to hear your comments and suggestions. And Tina, so take it away for us.
So we can't deny it. Pandemic has been on our minds the past year in 2020 and into 2021. What's interesting, when I originally started giving this lecture, and Deborah and I have done a lot of lectures on World War I and on the pandemic. When I originally started doing this several years ago, it was the pandemic. There wasn't the first pandemic, which is kind of the thing that we have to say now, which is a little startling when you think about it. As I go through, I'm going to kind of show you some states that had worst case scenarios. I'm going to show you the evolution of the three waves of the pandemic. But you're definitely going to be able to make a lot of comparisons between what we're experiencing now and what was happening back then. I'm not going to give any judgment. I'm going to leave that for you to decide. And I'm going to give maybe some modern statistics at the end to kind of help you frame what we're going through now with what was happening back in 1918, because it's inevitable. So how did this all begin? There were three distinct waves to the pandemic in 1918. The first wave began in late February to early March of 1918. In February of 1918, there was an unusually high outbreak of swine flu that was killing thousands of pigs in the Haskell, Kansas area. Nobody was really making the connection that there was the possibility that that disease could jump from swine, into humans and humans to become carriers. So it wasn't something that they had been able to pinpoint for a number of years. And in fact, a lot of it is still, even 100 years later, is just conjecture that they believe this is where it happened because of the version, the RNA of the flu that was able to be tested. So at the end of February, they're starting to see an unusually high number of pigs who are dying from this particular swine flu. About 2 weeks later, the beginning of March, that first week of March between the 1st and the 4th, they started to have soldiers coming into camp, into the base hospital at Camp Funston outside of Kansas City. So between March 4th and March 11th, 500 soldiers had become ill, which really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. They have what they consider to be flu seasons. We all experience that in our lifetimes. So when you have a number of soldiers who are in close contact and you start to see the first few soldiers becoming ill, it's inevitable that you're going to see more just because of that close contact. They didn't think anything of it. They thought, oh, it's that time of year. It's a typical flu season. Things will be fine. By the end of March, that number climbs to over 1,100 soldiers. But what's interesting about that first outbreak is that it stayed within its lane, so to speak, where the number of casualties, the number of mortality wasn't outside of what you would typically have in a regular flu season. So by the end of March, even with 1,100 soldiers becoming ill at Camp Funston, there were still less than a dozen soldiers who had actually perished from the flu. There was no need for panic. In fact, they didn't even know that that there was a need to panic because it's something that they were used to that would happen every fall and every spring. So you can see when they were putting the soldiers into the spare barracks and empty spaces because they had overflowed the hospital, there was no need to separate them. There was no need for blankets and sheets to separate the cots. There was no need for people to wear masks. None of that was necessary because they didn't see it as being anything out of the ordinary. Pretty soon it spreads out from the Midwest, just like cows and just like pigs are transported all over the US for food. That's exactly what was happening with the illness. It was going from railroad stop to railroad stop. It was going from military base and installation to military base and installation. And civilians and soldiers and sailors were getting sick just like everybody else. And again, nobody thought that that was anything any different than what you would normally have in a typical flu season. Now I'll talk about the numbers of that in just a few minutes. So in spring, what's happening overseas? So we have our soldiers who are getting ready and getting their units prepared to go overseas, to go over to France to fight in the AEF during the First World War. There are already soldiers there, and there are already versions of the flu already there. So what we're seeing, what's happening in March and into April, is exactly what they're seeing overseas in March and into April. Only the difference is it's a more virulent, a more dangerous, and a more deadly strain than what we're seeing in the United States in March and April of 1918. In the spring, the first reports start to come from overseas troops that a stronger than normal flu virus, coupled with a bronchitis, which was not being seen in the United States, wasn't being seen with those soldiers who were getting sick at Camp Funston and Camp Dodge and at Fort Dix. 10% of these are coming down with this really awful, terrible version of bronchitis. And it's causing a number of them to die from that illness, not from the initial flu, but from the bronchitis that they're seeing after it. Tens of thousands of cases are starting to show up with this new strain, and it just tears through the military overseas from late April and May into the I'd say early to mid summer. By the time we get to fall, we're all aware of what's going on in the fall. But before we get that far, I want to talk about what's happening in the spring, because a lot of times people overlook it and jump away from that first wave immediately into the second wave without recognizing what was starting to happen. So that summer, the troops in Europe are being absolutely decimated. They are being laid to waste by this new virulent strain of the virus, coupled with the bronchitis and pneumonia that's coming hot on its heels. So the German forces are reporting 30,000 cases, French forces, 50,000 cases, 30,000 in the British forces as well. But what's happening is it's decimating the civilian populations as well. These numbers are absolutely enormous. So we're seeing in Germany, 225,000 civilians are dying. In France, 135,000. Britain, 225,000. So when we think about the horrors of what comes in the second wave in the US in the fall of 1918, it's already there in Europe in the summer of 1918. And quickly it's spreading around the globe. So in May, in June, you're getting reports in Australia. You're getting reports in South America. You're getting reports in Northern Africa. You're getting reports in Asia. So it's quickly circling the globe faster because of the war and because of the war effort and because of the need to move troops and to move supplies than you might see when there's not a military engagement going on. But it's actually quite amazing that it takes so long to come back to the US. But certainly it does. It boomerangs its way right back to us. Now, these numbers are not hard and fast, and I'm going to talk about that more when I talk about what's going on in the US in the fall. There are a couple of reasons why these numbers are, best guesses. The first is the fact that military units don't want to let the enemy know exactly how many soldiers they have out of commission. So they're going to lowball their numbers just to make sure that they're not showing exactly how weak their forces are. And there's been reports on the British side and on the German line that if it had come out exactly how many soldiers were sick, there would have been no way they would have been able to, hold up their end of the Allied forces. The Germans would have been able to run right over them and vice versa, because they didn't have enough healthy soldiers in order to cover the lines, in order to defend their territories. So they're going to lowball those numbers because they don't want the enemy to know exactly how many people are ill. And they're also lowballing those numbers unintentionally, because if you're dealing with similar to what we're dealing with now, where hospitals are overrun and people are being put in hallways and they're being triaged out in the parking lot, are you going to take the time to stop and do paperwork on each and every person? So there are a lot of people who are missed in the counts, not because they're trying to do something nefarious and to undercount, just because they're so overwhelmed with what they're dealing with, that the numbers that they're counting, it's very plausible and pretty likely that they're going to be missing those who would count in those casualty figures. So here in the States, here in the Midwest, our soldiers from Illinois and from Iowa and from Kansas are getting ready to go overseas that summer. So as the war is raging and as the flu is raging in Europe in June, July, and August, our soldiers are heading over on troop caravans. They're heading over on ships and arriving at Brest, and then as those ships are being emptied and soldiers are coming home, they're not taking the time. They don't know that they need to clean those ships. They don't know that they need to disinfect, because they have absolutely no idea that this viral disease is being transported from soldier and sailor to the next round of soldiers and sailors. So you're seeing those men who are going overseas catching the illness, either from, the men that they're intermingling with as they're getting ready in their camp, or as they're intermingling on the dock, or once they're on board the ship, but they're carrying that disease with them on the ship over into France as well. So Camp Dodge, one of the men from my hometown, was a member of the 313th Engineers. He was in Company A. They had boarded the ships to go overseas. As soon as they arrived in Brest, they had 6 soldiers who were ill with the flu from their unit alone, from Company A. Within 3 days, 6 of them, all 6 of those men had died from the disease, and they had scores more who were ill, not only from Company A, but from, Company A through E, because that's who went overseas at that time. The head of their unit, the head of their Company A, Captain Bruce Honeyman, is one of those that dies 3 days after they arrive in France. It starts running through U.S. troops as they're arriving. Roughly 35% of the fighting men overseas are sick in the U.S. military. That's 1.2 million men. Of those 1.2 million men who are boots on the ground in France, 340,000 of them from July of 1918 until November, first week of November of 1918, are hospitalized with the flu and its complications. 43,000 U.S. soldiers will die in that time period. And that's just overseas. That's not including the soldiers and sailors who are dying in the United States, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. So think about that. Let that sink in for a second. If 35% of our soldiers are sick, compare that number against what's happening with British troops, French troops, German troops, and everybody else who is on that line. U.S. Army keeps very good records on those who are wounded, who are casualties. Now, if you're familiar with military terms, casualty can mean death, it can mean injury, it can mean illness. So the casualty files for the AEF for 1918, yes, the vast majority of them are going to be casualties, meaning deaths, but not all of them. But when I pulled out these boxes, Deborah and I were together in DC doing this research, and when I pulled out those boxes, nearly every card I pulled out of the box was somebody who had perished from either the flu or from the influenza or the bronchitis that struck them as they were recovering from the flu. These 4 cards are just a representative sample. They are all from the same unit. They are all deaths that had occurred within the same week. So now we're going to extrapolate that out. 43,000 of these cards in these AEF files are going to be soldiers who had perished from either the flu itself or from the influenza and from the bronchitis or pneumonia that struck immediately following. So you can look at the dates on these cards: September 28th, September 29th, September 27th. It boomerangs back to the United States. In August of 1918, an ocean liner arriving back with those passengers, like I said, they emptied them off the ship, immediately turned around, restocked them with more soldiers to come home, more people to come home, and came right back. You want to read some truly horrifying tales of what it was like for influenza to strike on board a ship? Just read about the USS Leviathan. Truly horrifying stories that come out of the Leviathan of soldiers and sailors who became ill on board. As soldiers are coming back, as the strain is coming back, the US Army and the Navy recognize, we've got something a little bit out of control on our hands. So when the ships were arriving on the eastern seaboard, they were requiring the soldiers and the sailors to quarantine in various places up and down the eastern seaboard. In Boston, they quarantined at the Boston Naval Yard. They quarantined at Camp Meade for people returning back through Baltimore Harbor. They quarantined people at Fort Dix in New Jersey. So they were pulling them aside and they were keeping an eye on them. But what they weren't really controlling were the citizens who were just re-entering into the general population, and they weren't quarantining the citizens who were working in the bases, who were free to come and go as they pleased. They'd come and they'd work for the day, and then they would go home to their family and to their communities at the end of the day. What makes this new flu strain so unique is the fact that it is, 25 times stronger than what you would see in that normal flu season. So I talked about a normal flu season would normally be a mortality rate of 0.02%. 0.02, not 0.2, 0.02% in any given flu season would die from their illness. That mortality rate for 1918 and 1919 jumps to 2.5%, which you might think, 2.5% in the general population is no big deal. That's 25% higher than normal. This disease is so deadly that it is killing at a 25 times higher rate than your average flu season. Like I said, by October, the reports of reporting the flu become completely overwhelming. It has crossed the globe, from Argentina to Alaska, from Norway to New Zealand. Every single community is experiencing death, and death at epic proportions, deaths like they have never seen before. Yes, there were flu seasons in the past. There was a really bad pandemic in 1889. There were bad flu seasons and pandemics afterwards. There were a couple more resurgences in the 1920s of this particular strain. Again in the 50s, again in the 1960s, what we're seeing now. This is like no other. No other flu strain has hit a mortality rate as high as this 1918-1919 pandemic. It felled everybody equally. It did not matter if you were rich or poor. It did not matter if you were famous, if you were a student. None of that mattered. Everybody was exposed equally to this. So some well-known people, you had Mary Pickford, who winds up contracting the flu virus from a bond parade that she does in Philadelphia, which I'll talk about Philadelphia in just a couple of minutes. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR, contracts the virus. Bess Wallace, if you're familiar with Bess Wallace, you might know her by her married name a little better. Her married name was Bess Truman. So both Bess Wallace at home in Independence, Missouri, is writing letters to her fiance, Lieutenant Harry Truman, overseas in the AEF. And both of them, and these letters are in the Truman Presidential Library, both of them are writing letters about their friends and their family and their soldiers and the other men in their units who are getting sick and who are dying. And they're writing back and forth to each other. Walt Disney, a 16-year-old hospital ambulance driver, comes down with the flu and gets sick. We'll talk about President Wilson at the very end of this, the third wave, who comes down with the flu and gets sick. So it took a tremendous toll on US life expectancy. One of the most startling statistics out of this is that in 1917, the average life expectancy was 51 years old, which is horrifying in and of itself that it was only 51 years old. But by 1918, that drops 12 years to 39 years old. The life expectancy drops 12 years because of the people who the flu is targeting. And who are those people? The young, those between the ages of 20 and 40, were much more likely to catch the flu virus and die from complications than were people who were very young and people who were very old. So when you look at a typical chart when you're dealing with a normal flu season, it would make a U. So you would have the very young and the very old susceptible to catching the virus and dying. But what you see is a distinct W in both of these charts. And Jeffrey Taubenberger has spent his entire life studying the pandemic for the CDC and for the military. So you can find his articles online fairly easily if you just do a search on his name. He's still very active in research on the pandemic. But what's unique about 1918 and 19 is the fact that it creates that W. It's targeting those people who are normally the healthiest, those people between the ages of 20 and 40. So why is this happening? Well, there's a couple of ideas. Again, nobody knows with 100% certainty, because even after all of these years and all of this research, there's no hard and fast answers. But the reason they believe it was targeting those people in those age brackets was, one, because those soldiers who were at the front were constantly providing a fresh host to the flu virus to help it along, to do what's called an antigen shift. So to move from one version of the virus to another version of the virus. And in this case, a much more contagious and a much more deadly strain of that same virus. We're starting to hear talk about an antigen shift now with what's going on in 2021. So when you constantly have a fresh new set of hosts, because of the way that the front is set up, where you would spend 2 weeks in the rear, 1 week at the front, and then another 3 weeks in the rear, you're constantly providing that virus a fresh body to infect, because conditions in the trenches were awful. You know, you're cold, you're wet, you're hungry, you're way more susceptible to disease. Your lungs are already compromised because of what you've been exposed to, whether through mustard gas or just being exposed to the elements. So every week, they're getting thousands of new hosts in order to infect. I hate to say it, women are getting sick too, but nowhere near at the rate that men are. Sorry, men, you're dying at a faster rate from this than women are, but women are still getting infected and dying as well. Women are in the factories. Women are in the schools. Women are in the hospitals where, again, they're working in close quarters, you know, where they're either elbow to elbow on the line, or they're elbow to elbow in the hospital taking care of patients, or, you know, they're in the schools trying to take care and teach children. So, you know, it's affecting people in those age groups because, you know, you're constantly being exposed to fresh hosts, but you're also in closer contact and in closer proximity. So that disease comes home, that boomerangs around, and now we're starting to see the start of the second wave of the pandemic. So Camp Devens, Massachusetts, is about 35 miles from Boston. Now, remember I said that Boston Navy Yard was doing its best to kind of sequester and quarantine the men that they could see were visibly ill. The problem with this technique is it's not showing you the people who are asymptomatic. And it's not showing you the people who are contagious, who are sick, who just aren't showing symptoms yet. So while it was a valiant effort to keep those men quarantined who appeared to be sick, it did absolutely no good for those who weren't sick yet, or those who were sick but weren't showing symptoms of being sick. So Camp Devens kind of became the spot where once you were cleared from the Naval Yard, you were shipped to Camp Devens. You would then get your orders and you would be shipped around the United States to wherever your final destination was going to be, whether that was going to be Fort Meade, whether it was going to be Camp Dodge, whether that was going to be across the coast in Portland and in Seattle. Camp Devens is where you would come when you got off the ship coming from the Boston Navy Yard. So it kind of becomes ground zero for that second wave of the influenza outbreak among US soldiers and sailors during that second wave in September, October, and November of 1918. Soldiers are arriving at the end of July. You start to see more coming back mid-August to the first week of September. The first soldier comes into the hospital at Camp Devens on September 7th. He's the only one that comes into the hospital sick. They don't know what's wrong with him. He has a high fever. He has the shakes. He's very, very ill. And they don't recognize what this is. So they misdiagnose him with spinal meningitis. They treat him. He recovers. He does not die. He recovers. They send him on his way. They don't have another soldier coming in with similar symptoms. So they don't think twice when the Army is sending out releases, press releases to all of the different military bases along the Eastern Seaboard that last week of August and first week of September saying, you know, we're starting to see the signs of a pandemic on our hands. You know, we have soldiers coming in, you know, with these symptoms. They're not seeing those same types of symptoms yet. So They disregard it and don't think that it's pertaining specifically to them or to the single soldier who has come in those next couple of weeks. And I want you to keep September 7th in your mind, that week of September 7th, as I talk about dates going forward. Between September 7th and September 14th, the soldiers who had arrived are then shipped all across the country. You have a handful of soldiers who go to Rockford in Illinois. You have a handful of soldiers and officers who go to Great Lakes in Illinois. You have a handful of soldiers who get sent to Kentucky, into Kansas City, from Camp Devens to these other places. They get on their troop trains, away they go. They start to hear rumors around the 14th, 15th, 16th, that there are other men who are starting to take ill, but nothing in any numbers, and nobody's coming into the hospital. No one arrives at the hospital until September 22nd. Boom. Everything explodes at Camp Devens all at once. On one single day, on September 22nd, 1,500 men report sick to the hospital. Now, the base hospital is equipped to handle 1,200 men. They have 25 doctors on staff, which is a really good, sturdy hospital, and they have about a dozen nurses available to help those who are ill. But there's no way that 25 doctors and 12 nurses can handle 1,500 men when they don't even have enough beds for 1,500 men. So they're pouring in by the thousands per day. So they've got them in hallways, then they start spilling out into taking over empty barracks, and then taking over empty motor pools, and finally just starting to, put up tents on the parade grounds just to try to deal with the thousands upon thousands of soldiers who report sick. September 22nd, remember I mentioned the 7th, the 14th, September 22nd, 1,500 men report ill. By September 26th, they are so overrun, overworked, and ill-equipped, they have to shut the hospital. 4 days into this outbreak, they have to shut down the hospital. They put out a call begging anybody who is anywhere near Camp Devens, please send us more doctors and nurses. They put out a plea to the Red Cross, who sends 12 more nurses. Within a week, 8 of those nurses will become ill with the flu, and 2 of them will die. The first nurse registered as having died during the course of the pandemic is Miss Margaret Sullivan. She's the first casualty of the nursing corps during the pandemic. Now, the numbers don't stop. They're still seeing hundreds upon hundreds of men pouring into the hospital every single day. This comes from the files at the National Archives in College Park, and it is a note saying, commanding all officers will expedite the shipment of bodies in every possible way. Look at the date, September 24th, 2 days into the pandemic, into this outbreak. They've already run out of winding sheets. They've run out of caskets. They've run out of ways to transport these soldiers, these boys, to get their bodies home to their families. And it doesn't stop. By the start of October, they have 100 men a day who are dying. You've got thousands of men who are still ill. By the end, 10 weeks later, from September 22nd, it crests the middle of October around the 16th, and then the numbers start to come down. By the beginning of November, over 8,800 soldiers, nearly 20%, just shy of 20% of the entire camp, will become ill. They register their official death toll as being just under 800 deaths. Now, remember what I said. This number can be taken with a grain of salt, because the number could potentially be higher based on how overwhelmed they were, how they had to shut down the hospitals, how they had to leave soldiers in their barracks that were ill because they didn't have the ability to take them in and treat them in the hospital. And a lot of soldiers were misdiagnosed. As we saw, that first soldier who came in the hospital that was misdiagnosed as spinal meningitis, that's something that you'll see in camps across the country. This outbreak is so bad and it is so devastating, and the camp is so overwhelmed, that the U.S. Army sends its 3 top doctors. They send Colonel Welch, they send Rufus Cole, and they send Victor Vaughn. Now, both Victor Vaughn and Colonel Welch were kind of experts on communicable diseases. They had been in the Canal Zone. They had worked with people who had malaria outbreaks. They had dealt with death and disease for over the course of 20 years since the Spanish-American War. Both Welch and Vaughn are completely shaken by what they've seen. And these are career military men, and they are shaken by what they've come across. Vaughn is quoted as saying there was blood everywhere, on linens, on clothes, pouring out of their nostrils, that many of them were turning blue. These young, normally healthy, ruddy young men, were turning blue and suffocating to death. They were drowning in their own fluids because of what was happening to their bodies. John Barry is considered probably, one of the best storytellers and the best documentarians of the Great Influenza. His book, The Great Influenza, I believe is on its 3rd edition right now. He's still on the lecture circuit talking about the pandemic, so you could easily find some recent presentations that he's done on that topic. But what John Barry has to say as he's reading the reports from these men are truly horrifying. These men are suffocating in their own blood and in their own fluids because it's just decimating their lungs. It's completely obliterating the villi in their lungs, so they can't breathe and they eventually just drown. And the blue is an indication that, they're not long for this earth. So what's happening in Boston at the Boston Navy Yard, what's happening at Camp Devens is starting to spill out a little at a time into the general population. You start to get cases of those being checked into local hospitals in Boston right around that same time period, September 25th to the 29th. You start to see a marked uptick in the number of flu cases that are amongst civilian populations. By mid-October, it has just run roughshod over all of Massachusetts. So you're seeing cases and you're hearing stories in newspaper column after newspaper column reporting obituaries of the normally young and healthy all across Massachusetts. Philadelphia is aware. They know what's going on. They're seeing the reports. They're receiving the same type of information that the military is sending out to the military installation just on the edge of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia feels that it doesn't apply to them. So Philadelphia is an interesting case, and it's a worst case scenario of what can happen when a number of factors all go wrong at the same time. So not only does Philadelphia ignore all the public health warnings that are coming out of Boston, that are coming out of Camp Devens, that are coming out of the Boston Navy Yard, Philadelphia also has a machine which is responsible for running a huge portion, a Republican machine, which is responsible for running a huge portion of the city. So they're doing their own thing. And then Mayor White, the old mayor of Philadelphia, is sitting in jail at the start of the pandemic because he's arrested on corruption charges. So there's nobody at the helm of the ship in Philadelphia. It's left to cruising in the machine, and it's left to the women's aid societies, the well-off, hoity-toity celebrity housewives, so to speak, to kind of fill in that void. So throughout September, from the 21st through the 28th, they're hearing about the numbers of casualties that are building in Massachusetts, and they ignore those public health warnings. They are encouraged, they are begged, they are pleaded with to cancel the bond parade that they have scheduled for the end of the month. And the public health officials and the machine says, no, we're not going to cancel this parade. We are way too close to reaching our goal and hitting our fund, the amount of money that we had promised to raise for the war effort. So they push ahead, knowing that it's going to be a catastrophe. They ignore all warnings. On September 28th, 200,000 people take to the streets in Philadelphia to celebrate the 4th bond drive and to raise money to support the war effort. That's where you get people like our actresses and our actors, who are supporting the war effort. This is where Mary Pickford catches the flu, is at this parade. 200,000 people. Within 72 hours, flu cases start pouring into local hospitals. By the beginning of October, the hospitals are completely overrun. They do take the effort to set up a couple of field hospitals, Red Cross hospitals in Philadelphia. What's fascinating about Philadelphia, well, it's not really fascinating, it's really kind of tragic, is that Philadelphia sets up these field hospitals in the white wealthy neighborhoods. They never set up any field hospitals. They never go out of their way to reach out to the people of color. They don't go into Germantown. They don't go into, like in Boston, in Baltimore, they don't go into the Fourth Ward to make sure that they're taking care of, the people of color, the Blacks in their community, the immigrants in their community. They basically just leave them to fend for themselves. Within 1 month, over 12,000 people are dead from the flu in Philadelphia. On October 10th alone, nearly 800 people perished from the epidemic. It is so bad in Philadelphia that the machine puts out a request. We will pay anybody money if they will pick up a shovel and bury the dead. They have no takers. Nobody wants to touch this. So people are just stacking bodies on their porches and outside their front doors, hoping somebody's going to come and collect them and bury them. There are couples laying dead in bed together. There are children who are going hungry because either their parents are so sick or they've already perished from the pandemic that there's nobody to take care of them. So when you look at these numbers in Philadelphia, 12,000 people, those are 12,000 white people. Those aren't including the immigrants who are going underreported, the Blacks or the people of color who aren't being reported. So that's why when you hear statistics like 675,000 Americans perished during the flu pandemic, that number is probably closer to 1 million because of all of those people who went unreported. Great collection that is online from the University of Pennsylvania of articles from the Gazette about what was happening in Philadelphia at the time. Alfred Crosby wrote a fantastic book in the 1920s, kind of chronicling what was going on during the pandemic. And he tells the tale about how the city morgue was so overwhelmed by the number of bodies to be buried that they were leaving them in hallways and in corridors, that they didn't have enough refrigeration to keep the bodies cold. So they were basically, sorry to gross anybody out, but they were basically rotting in the hallways because there was no way to keep them cool and there was nobody there to bury them. John Barry tells a very similar story about what's happening in Philadelphia, where he talks about a small boy who wanders into the morgue because the door was open, because the stench was so great. They tried to air the place out by opening the doors. And this young 4-year-old boy wanders in and just sees death smacking him in the face, and how traumatizing it was to him and his father to witness this. So what's happening in Philadelphia is that worst case scenario. Like I said, there's not enough people to handle the sheer number of bodies that are coming in. Now, St. Charles Borromeo, which is a seminary on the outskirts of Philadelphia, decides that they're going to take care of this themselves. Them and a group of local police officers decide that they're going to take up responsibility for burying the dead. So they started digging mass graves. And this is an image from the local newspaper of what was happening there. So they had tagged all of the bodies with the assumption that when the pandemic was over, that people were going to come back and claim their loved ones and bury them appropriately. Yeah, that never happened. So there are large swaths of Philadelphia cemeteries where these mass graves are located. Now, what about here in Illinois? Illinois did not get through this pandemic unscathed. So Camp Grant was one of those that I mentioned that was receiving those soldiers who were leaving from Camp Devens that middle of September. About a month before, Commander Charles Hagedorn arrives to his new command. On August 8th, he takes over as the commander for Camp Grant. Now, he's a career military man. He's in his mid-50s. He has been doing this job for decades already. So he's well-versed in how to take care of a military installation, how to deal with soldiers, how to handle troop movements. What he's not prepared for is the pandemic. So he recognizes that the base is overcrowded, and he doesn't like the fact that there are tents set up on the parade grounds to house the excess soldiers. So he insists to his military personnel that all of those tents need to be emptied before winter comes, because he doesn't want any soldier sleeping in a tent through a brutal Illinois winter. The biggest mistake he could have ever made. So by the first week of September, all of those tents are dismantled, and all of those soldiers are now overcrowded in the barracks, in the wooden barracks on Camp Grant. September 15th, that trainload of officers arrives from Camp Devens. Nobody thinks anything of it because, again, Camp Devens doesn't have its first set of cases until the 22nd. September 21st is when it begins at Camp Grant. By midnight that night, they have 108 cases. Commander Hagedorn thinks it's okay, we've got this. But every day, 100, 200, 300 more soldiers are pouring into the base hospital at Camp Grant. 2.5 weeks, right as Camp Grant is hitting its peak of the pandemic, Commander Hagedorn takes his own life and commits suicide on October 8th, that same day that the 500th soldier dies from the flu. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't end there. They're not even at the halfway point yet of the number of soldiers who are going to die at Camp Grant. Commander Hagedorn tells his staff to go out onto the parade grounds and wait for him to come out. Everybody evacuates the building. They're standing on the parade ground and they're waiting. 20 minutes later, Commander Hagedorn hasn't come out yet. So his lieutenant goes to take a step forward to go into the building to find out what's holding him up when he hears the report of the shot and Colonel Hagedorn taking his own life. Rockford's not going to peak until right around October 15th, October 16th, right about the same time that you're seeing peaks in Chicago and other cities around the Midwest. Those numbers at Camp Grant are going to continue to rise until the first week of November. So Camp Grant was one of the most heavily impacted Army bases in the fall of 1918. So I talked about Camp Devens and I talked about how they had 8,800 soldiers who had come down ill. That number at Camp Grant is over 12,000 soldiers and staff who become ill. Almost 1,100 perish. Again, keep this number in mind. They're completely overwhelmed. It's very possible that they might have missed some people. So it's possible that this number could be slightly higher. Also, they don't want to make it look like they're not doing their jobs at their camp. So, their numbers might not be as high as they normally would have been reporting, because they don't want to let the enemy know that, they're suffering weaknesses. Camp Grant struggles to keep up with the shipments of bodies, just like Great Lakes will. So they put out a call for what they call the Grand Morgue or the Great Morgue, where they're asking any funeral director or anybody who has any embalming experience to please come to Rockford. Please send us all of your winding cloths. Please send us all of your caskets. So people from my hometown here in Oswego, people from Aurora, people from Plainfield and Joliet were going up. Undertakers and funeral directors were going up to Rockford to help them deal with the catastrophe. Now, this is happening all across Illinois, but I have to give Governor Loudon a lot of credit because Governor Loudon recognizes he heeded the warnings. He took the advice of what was coming out of the public health officials on the Eastern Seaboard. He recognizes that this is a very serious outbreak and that we need to get a handle on it, and we need to get a handle on it early. So remember what I was saying that week of September 25th, as other communities are downplaying the pandemic, or they're not taking it seriously, or they're continuing to hold, public rallies and hold events. Governor Loudon recognizes right away that we need to set up a committee and we need to have a central point of communication. So he sets up the emergency committee on the 25th. On the 26th of September, he orders the closing of all political assemblages. Nobody's going to meet in public for any reason. Close public buildings, close schools, close churches. How many of those cities actually complied? Not very many of them. Some of them did on certain things. Some of them didn't at all. So here in Plainfield, yes, they kept schools open, but they closed churches. They closed the public buildings. So they tried to kind of pick and choose what they were going to obey and what they weren't going to obey from the governor. Unfortunately, Chicago decided to ignore all of those warnings. And we're going to talk about Chicago in a little bit. But I have a lot of respect for Governor Loudon for, stepping in right away and making, this, an emergency, recognizing the importance of it. So lucky for us in Illinois, they started publishing an annual health report the previous year. So volume 1, the first edition came out in 1918, covering 1917. And then the second edition for 1918 came out in the early months of 1919. And any of you who live in Southern Illinois might get a kick out of this. I actually love this. So there was a soldier who was recently returned from a military installation in Oglethorpe, Georgia. He was at Camp Forest. So a soldier comes home, returns to Southern Illinois, returns to Alexander County. Everybody wants to see him. Everybody wants to shake his hand, give him a hug. Hey, we're glad you're back. Nobody seems to think anything about the fact that his nose is running. He's got a slight cough. Oh, I'm just feeling a little bit under the weather. So he goes to, all the local hangouts. He stops at the bar, he visits the local grocery store. And once he's done visiting with everybody in his community, he decides he's going to go to his girlfriend's community in the next community over, hangs out with them. Everybody's happy to see him, hugging, shaking hands. He becomes the super spreader for Southern Illinois. So in the public health report, the second annual public health report, they call this guy out for, getting, practically half of Southern Illinois sick with, from the flu, from the pandemic. So when you think that one person can't make a difference, let me tell you, this poor soldier really bared the brunt of, the number of cases that were diagnosed in Southern Illinois. So you can read that here on the screen. So he was already complaining of not feeling well and nobody thought anything of it. So he winds up becoming a super spreader and infecting 2 counties worth of citizens. Death reaches every community. There is not a community in Illinois that did not have at least one person perish in the pandemic. But its toll is much larger than that because there were plenty of people who had gotten ill that survived. So really the pandemic reached its hand into virtually every household. Either someone was ill or somebody had perished or somebody knew somebody who was sick or worked in a location where somebody was sick and died or worked, in some field, whether nursing or education, where, they're experiencing this firsthand. Every newspaper across the state is reporting on those dying, whether in their community or serving their country. The one in the center where it says locals, that's from my community paper, that's from Plainfield. And if you look at the bottom, it says Dr. Owens is reporting on the sick list. He has been out so much of late attending to his practice that he suffered a breakdown. So it wasn't just the citizens and it wasn't just the soldiers that were getting sick and were dying. The healthcare professionals, the nurses, the doctors were dying at an astounding rate. And those who weren't dying, were coming down with, having nervous breakdowns, and a huge number of them actually committed suicide. Medical profession journals are full at the backs, page after page after page, of their profession who died because of either the flu or because of the pneumonia that accompanied it. Whether you're looking at JAMA, or you're looking at the New England Journal of Medicine, or you're looking at nursing journals, every single one of them has columns and pages listing the deaths of those within their professions. And I circled some of them for you. Died of pneumonia following influenza, died of pneumonia following influenza, page after page after page. But what's even more concerning are, as you look through these intermixed, you're going to see suicide, 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 suicide. Thousands died at their posts, but then there were many more who just suffered nervous breakdowns, who never recovered, were never the same, were never able to go back to work, as well as those who just took their own lives from the horrors of what they saw. So Great Lakes Naval Training Station, like I said, they've received soldiers, they received officers who had come from Camp Devens. The first group of men, reported that first week of September. Remember, I said that there was a troop train that had left on September 7th. They arrive in Great Lakes the next day, and you already are starting to have reports of men coming to the base hospital with what is being reported as meningitis, the exact same symptoms that you saw from the soldier who reported on September 7th at Camp Devens, showing up at Great Lakes with those exact same symptoms. And I have no doubt in my mind that this was probably one of those officers who had left Devens and had come to Great Lakes, had been the first to take ill. Their camp commander acted quickly, refused leave for everybody. Nobody was leaving the base. Quarantined 1,000 people who were symptomatic. This is by about September 15th. Quarantined those who were symptomatic, but not civilians. So once again, civilians were allowed to come and go. They were allowed to do their jobs and then go back to the communities at the end of the day. So putting places like Wilmette and Winnetka at risk because nobody was keeping an eye on those civilian employees. By September 16th, you've got 5,000 more men quarantined because they're suspected as having come in contact with the ill. So again, just like we saw on the Eastern Seaboard, you've got, we're going to quarantine those guys. Hey, you look sick. You look like you're running a fever. We're going to quarantine you. But they didn't think to quarantine those people who had been in contact until the following week. So the number grows. 5,000 men are now in quarantine. So nobody can leave the base. Nobody can take leave. But again, they're not stopping the people who are coming in and who are going every day. All soldiers are given a daily throat spray. They're gargling with salt water to try to beat what's coming. They've seen the reports. They know what to expect. September 14th, we're taking precautions. We're not letting anybody leave. We're making sure everybody's getting their gargle, their throat spray. By the 25th, they haven't even crested with their number of soldiers who are coming down sick, with the number who are showing up in the hospital. But just like in other places, they're already declaring, well, the worst of it is over. We can go on with our daily lives now. Those numbers continue to rise until the end of October. A week later, or a day later, I should say, they're sending out messages of sympathy. We're so sorry for the families who are having to come and collect, their sons and their daughters who have perished at Great Lakes Naval Base. There's a young nurse, her name is Mabel Brown, who tells the story on her 100th birthday. So Mabel lives to be 100 years old. They interview her for the Naval magazine, and she talks about what she saw. Her first station as a young nurse was at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. And I'll let you see a little snippet of a quote from her in that article on the next slide. Total registered flu cases by September 25th is 8,200. Like I said, not even hit the peak yet. 369 cases the day before. The men are dying at such an alarming rate. Great Lakes goes out and buys up all of the winding sheets they can find between Chicago and North Chicago, between, Winnetka and Wilmette and the north side of the city of Chicago. They buy up every winding sheet they can find. There are so many men coming into the hospital sick. They're putting them in winding cloths the moment they come into the hospital, even though they're not dead, because they assume they're not going to make it. So they've got young men on cots who are dying. They've got young men on the floor on the stretchers waiting to take those beds as soon as those soldiers perish. And then they're taking those sailors who have perished, and they're taking them to the train station and to the morgue to send their bodies back home to their families. Morgue is stacked to capacity, floor to ceiling. Ambulances are leaving around the clock to take bodies to the train station so that those bodies can be shipped home to their families. Like I said, Mabel Brown lived to be 100. She talks about what she saw. They were dying so quickly, that they would put the men into the winding sheets as soon as they came in. They would tag their left toe, even though they weren't dead, just in case. She said as one died, another one was there to take his place. Every time an ambulance driver brought in more sick boys, they were taking the dead bodies out with them. It was a constant cycle. She said the morgue was stacked to capacity so high that she felt bad. The boys were stacked like cordwood, one on top of the other. She said she always felt bad for the boy who was on the bottom. Just imagine that for a second. Bodies stacked floor to ceiling, waiting to be returned to their families. Now let's talk about Chicago. If there has to be a villain, and there always has to be a villain in the story, John Dill Robertson is that villain for me. Some other people don't think that John Dill Robertson is a villain. I'm happy to debate that with you. To me, he's 100% a villain. So John Dill Robertson, patronage job, gets appointed to be the public health commissioner for the city of Chicago. He had been in that position for less than 2 months when the pandemic reaches the Great Lakes, when it reaches our shore on Lake Michigan. As he's seeing these numbers rise at Rockford, at Wilmette, at Great Lakes, he says, we're keeping an eye on it. No need to worry. We've got this under control. September 23rd, Robertson declares, We've got the Spanish influenza well in hand. No need to panic. We're just fine. By September 30th, the city of Chicago has 260 verified cases. Now, what do we know about outbreaks? For every one case that you have that's verified, you have the potential for having 5 to 10 more that are undocumented. So by the 30th already, we have 260 verified cases of the pandemic within the city's limits. Now, Governor Loudon, on the 26th of September, had ordered people to close everything down. He was being proactive as best that he could. John Bel Robertson ignored every warning that the governor had put out. The governor had asked on that same day, on September 26th, that this become a documentable illness, that you need to start recording how many people have influenza in your city limits. John Roberts ignores him. On October 1st, he agrees to quarantine those who appear symptomatic. We've already talked about the efficiency and efficacy of doing something like that. Within the week, the numbers become astronomical. We've already hit that tipping point by the first week of October. 40,000 residents are now verifiably sick. And he has the audacity to proclaim October 8th that the backbone of the epidemic is broken. We've hit the worst of it. Everything is downhill from here. We are going to be perfectly fine. Robertson, again, does absolutely nothing to take care of the people of color within his communities. They do not go out and offer any type of signage, any type of, documentation about how to avoid the flu in ethnic neighborhoods, in largely immigrant communities, in communities of color in the city of Chicago. What does he do? He decides to close the theater district in downtown Chicago. If you've been to downtown Chicago, you're familiar with the theater district around State Street. John Bel Robertson orders the closing of the theater district and entertainment centers for the wealthy. He doesn't close the bowling alleys, the saloons, the pool halls where, poorer citizens of Chicago would hang out. He doesn't close schools or churches or limit public assemblage. He doesn't do any of that. John Bel Robertson is quoted as saying on October 8th, when they closed the theater district, "What are those poor theater girls going to do? They're going to live, John. That's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to live." John Bel Robertson, after October 16th, when Chicago kind of hits its peak during the pandemic, bragged to his colleagues that nothing was done to interfere with the morale of the community. John Bel Robertson did not put out any information to alert people to exactly how horrible and how dangerous this pandemic was. He didn't want to scare anybody. He didn't want anybody to panic. So he chose to do nothing instead. Schools remained open. They didn't close public schools until October 16th. Or I take that back. Schools always remained open. They didn't curtail other public activities until October 16th, when they closed churches and they decided to close pool halls and other assemblage points. Those 2 weeks between October 8th and the 21st, the Chicago Tribune and other reports coming out of other local newspapers are reporting at its peak, 1,200 new cases are being reported each and every day. In those poorer communities, those numbers are staggering. And I'm going to show you a graph of that in just a second. Cook County Hospital, which is a county hospital, it's not one of the expensive private hospitals on the north side. It was dealing with, it was the poor hospital that was dealing with the poor ethnic and people, neighborhoods of color. Had one of the highest mortality rates for flu victims in the entire nation. Almost 40% of people who came in with the flu or the pneumonia that came with it died from their illness. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, people in these neighborhoods had to go to work. They might have been their only breadwinner. They didn't have money to fall back on. They had to go to work. And they also weren't being educated on what was going on. So these people weren't coming into the hospital until they were so sick they could no longer take care of themselves. So the mortality rate is higher in this particular hospital than what you would see at Martha Washington on the north side or at Presbyterian St. Luke's. The books exist at the IRAD, at the Northeastern Illinois University IRAD in Chicago. They have the Cook County Hospital admissions books. including 1918. So here's a little snippet of one of the pages, and you could just see, many recovered, but not everybody. So at the bottom, you can see death, death, death. There were a number of people who just didn't survive this. And here's the full page. Nearly everybody being checked into the hospital between October 8th and October 21st were people who were coming in as either sick from the flu or who were sick from the pneumonia that accompanied it. So when I looked at this page, I kind of chuckled to myself because I was like, oh, fractured ribs, that's unique. Everybody else is there for pneumonia or bronchitis. So how did the county report their flu victims? So this is again from that second annual health report that the state put out in 1919. And you can look, Alexander County, where we had our soldier who went on to infect 2 counties worth of citizens, 534 people died of the flu. You look at Cook County, 15,000, or were ill with the flu, I apologize. Cook County, 15,000 people were reported ill. City of Chicago, 43,000 people were reported ill with the flu. We know those numbers are staggeringly low because we know by the second week of the pandemic, they had already hit 40,000. So the estimate is that the number could be as high as 120,000 for the city of Chicago because of underreporting. Those ethnic neighborhoods, those neighborhoods of color, there's a graduate student who several years ago did a deep dive into the mortality rates in these ethnic neighborhoods in and around the city of Chicago. So you can see the darker red squares are the neighborhoods that had the highest mortality rates. So again, remember I said that the mortality for the pandemic was 2.5%, which was up from the 0.002% you would normally see during a typical flu season. Some of these neighborhoods, some of these numbers ran as high as nearly 21%. Neighborhoods like Pullman, Little Village, which was hit hard in this pandemic in the spring of 2020. See neighborhoods like Back of the Yards in Canaryville that were struck particularly hard by the pandemic in those working class neighborhoods. So I grew up in Bridgeport on the south side, right by Canaryville and Back of the Yards. So if you were to extrapolate those numbers out, that 20.59%, 20,000 people lived in Bridgeport on the 1920 census. That would be losing an average of 400 residents. So those numbers are kind of staggering when you look at some of these communities that were hit particularly hard and where they were. So now what about that third wave? I live in Oswego. Oswego managed to survive the first 2 waves and got hammered in January of 1919. How it happens, who knows? But communities that were struck particularly hard in that third wave of 1919, from January to April, it kind of crests and dies down by May of 1919. You see cities like Oakland, Portland, Phoenix, Western Seaboard gets hit particularly hard in the third wave. Countries like Australia get hit hard. France gets hit hard again in the spring of 1919, which is where President Wilson contracts the virus. Now, there's a lot of speculation about had the Versailles Accord been as harsh as it was, had President Wilson not contracted the flu in Paris when he was there in March of 1919. It's a very fascinating discussion because when Wilson gets sick and then has his stroke, it is well documented among the people who knew him best that his demeanor had completely shifted 180, that he went from being a genteel and responsible and kind individual to being just a monster, to being stubborn and bullheaded and cruel to people. And Wilson, who was in favor of there being no German reparations up until the time that he had a stroke, came down on a hard line, refusing to accept the accord until Germany was forced to pay. And a lot of that speculation has kind of revolved around whether or not they think that it was a result of him catching the flu, because he did nearly die. He had a fever of nearly 106. He was very, very ill for a prolonged period of time. But for the rest of the world and for the rest of the country, that antigen shifts again. And it goes back into that lane that normal range of 0.02%, until eventually by the summer of 1919, it's gone. Like I said, there were flare-ups again. There were flare-ups in 1921. There were flare-ups again in mid-1920s from this strain of the flu, where you had more of an epidemic, but not quite a pandemic on your hands. But there were lots of communities that were still very shaken by even the third wave of that last final wave of the pandemic. Global estimates from 20 to 100 million. People kind of agree a rough number of being about 50 million. I think the number is probably closer to 80 or 100. Like I said, think of the underreporting that was going on. Think of these communities where, there wasn't a public record. Whole communities like indigenous communities in Alaska and in Canada that were completely wiped off the face of the earth. There was nobody there to count them. People of color, communities of color, ethnic neighborhoods and communities grossly being underreported. You had military installations being underreported as well. So that number is a guideline and it's an estimate. Reportedly, between 25 and 30% of Americans contracted the virus. I've seen reports as high as 36%. I'm more willing to go with that number than the low number of 25%. Again, an estimated 675,000 succumbed to the disease. I truly believe that number is probably closer to 1 million. In the end, 60,000 US soldiers would die, just over. 17,000 soldiers die stateside. And that number I gave you earlier, 43,000 soldiers died in the AEF overseas in France. Military records that came out after this. So the Journal of American Medical Association put out a chart in their final issue of the year in December of 1918, giving the numbers out of the camps. So you could see Camp Devens, infection rate of just shy of 13,400 of influenza. How many came down with pneumonia from that number? Almost 2,300. How many deaths? Camp Devens only reported 794 deaths. So that number is, one of those question marks. When you look at the reports that were coming out and the paperwork that was being generated by Camp Devens, the number seems to be considerably higher than what the American Medical Association is reporting the numbers to be. Same thing with down, if you look a little lower, you're going to see Camp Grant, you're going to see Fort Sherman, you're going to see Camp Johnston. These numbers, 1,100 soldiers. Nearly 1,100 soldiers succumbing to the disease. So you had a lot of soldiers who perished during the pandemic. And this is only covering the first two waves. It doesn't cover those soldiers and sailors who got sick in the winter and spring of 1919. There were scientists who spent their entire lives trying to get to the bottom of what this was. Alfred Crosby, who I had mentioned earlier, Johann Halton, Richard Schopp, Kristen Duncan. Again, I mentioned Jeffrey Taubenberger already about the amazing work that he's been doing. Paul Lewis went into the lab at the first signs of the pandemic and never left his office. He spent the rest of his life working on this. This man was dedicated to figuring out exactly what caused this. And unfortunately, he passed away without ever knowing what the original culprit was. So it took decades upon decades to finally be able to discover the RNA strand that created this deadly pandemic. And it came out to be H1N1, which we know of as being the swine flu. So people like Johann Halton, Gina Colada in her book Flu talks about how Johann Halton had gotten permission to go into these indigenous communities that were above the permafrost, where they could exhume bodies that had been frozen, because it was the only way where they were going to get good samples of the flu virus in order to test it to discover what the RNA was. So she tells the story of Johann Halton in the 1950s with a cooler and a pair of garden shears, going out and exhuming bodies in these communities and getting permission, and then bringing those samples back in order to test them in the lab. So lots of people did lots of work on this until they could finally have an answer. And like I said, 100 years later, a lot of this is still just speculation and conjecture, because either the samples had eroded over time, or they just didn't have the technology through the decades to be able to to give a definitive answer. So what they offer are still, in a lot of instances, their best guesses. Online resources, feel free to take a screenshot of this. All of these are publicly available. Fold 3 is by subscription, but otherwise you have access to all of the rest of these for free online. Like I had mentioned before, newspapers are a great source to dig deeper into some of these articles, and you can find those through some of these Great Lakes Bulletin from Great Lakes Naval Base. It's the top one that you have access to as well. Some really great resources are out there available for you. So what are those comparisons? If you run the numbers, currently what is happening globally in 2020, 2021, we have 92 million people around the world who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Again, for every one diagnosis you have, you run the risk of 5 to 10 not having been diagnosed. The number of deaths that we've seen are just shy of 3 million. So if you extrapolate those numbers out, oddly enough, it still falls into that 0.02%. But you also have to keep in mind that the population is times upon times higher now, with 8 billion residents on planet Earth right now, as opposed to the number of people who, the 2.5 billion, I think it was, that were alive during the pandemic in 1918. So when you look at those numbers, they don't really account for how the population has exploded in that 100 years either. But it's certainly something that you should investigate further. And as I've been talking, I'm sure some of you have kind of made your own correlations and seen, your own comparisons or contrasts. There was no federal, and I just drew a blank. I apologize.
Yeah, there was no federal plan.
There you go.
Yeah,
there was no unified federal response because Wilson wanted all of his time to be brought into the war effort. He didn't want anything to interfere with raising funds for the war effort. So he left it up to the individual cities and states to decide. Some did a great job. Some went out of their ways to work hard and get it right, like Governor Loudon. Some, like Philadelphia, the ship capsized early and they were never able to recover. There's a community in Colorado that actually survived without ever having a single case of the pandemic because they stationed people at either ends of the city limits and said, if you come in, we will shoot you. So nobody was allowed in and nobody was allowed out, and they had 0 cases. So it was really left up to the individuals to decide. So it's an interesting case study.
Yeah, it is.
I will leave it at that. Did not offer any other comparisons to 2020.
No, I've got one for you, Tina, this is like the crazy bit as I turn my camera on, and of course I'm like not finding there are my view options, but so the best bit for me has been so there are, what you'll see is that people will say, that there were anti-mask leagues. That was a big one. So there was no federal response or no organized federal response. There was a slew of misinformation, but in the case of World War I, it was more of Wilson's crackdown on media and free speech during that time period. So you're still seeing a correlation between that, as far as still there's misinformation being broadcast.
Oh, absolutely. You had shysters out there saying, eat more oranges, wear garlic, whatever, eat more onions, whatever they could do to sell whatever produce and product they had on the shelf that they could get rid of. Yes, there were anti-maskers, and a lot of them were, West Coast, because it hadn't hit them yet. Well, what do I have to do this for? It hasn't gotten here yet. So this is ridiculous. But also keep in mind too, that the masks that were being produced by the Red Cross and by young ladies and nurses around the US were gauze masks, which weren't going to do any good anyway. Much different from, what we're suggesting to people in the information that's being put out today about making sure that it's multi-layer and that you can't breathe through it and try to blow out a candle. You're wearing a gauze mask. I mean, it wasn't going to do much.
Yeah, it's one of those things too, where I think with masks, they had mask brigades that if you weren't wearing them, you would get fined. And that's something now that you're starting to see. You're also seeing that people are saying, well, by wearing a mask, you're you're violating my constitutional rights. You'll see those articles, you see them, you see those quotes, you see those articles in between 1918, 1919, and you also see them now. The other bit that I absolutely, it's so, this happens a lot in disaster situations where people say, oh, this is God's wrath. This is, everybody needs to atone more, that, Jesus needs to take the wheel, whatever it is. We saw this after the tsunami in Japan. We saw this after any sort of natural event that people will say this pandemic is because of God's wrath. And
plague in the 14th century with the people wearing the pointy hats and the curly shoes because they were like, well, we might as well go all out now because we don't know what's coming.
Right. And it's one of those things where when we look at, having those kind of ideas that if we can atone or sacrifice or just, try to be better people, that, God will forgive us, and, that we feel like we have some sort of control. And in this instance, our myths mislead us in a lot of situations because it's not, and this is the other bit, it doesn't help that our myths mislead us that it's like one person who can save us, like Brad Pitt, Drakalian, or Noah, like pandemic response is not sexy. It would not make a good movie. It's not Marvel.
Sure it would.
It's not a Marvel cinematic universe. It's not even a Mandalorian type of story.
Come on, haven't you watched Contagion? Come on, what's wrong with you? There's all kinds of great pandemic movies out there.
But it's all about like one person or like 2 or 3 people saving millions of people. And that's just not the case. A lot of pandemic response is, we've been told for decades that a pandemic is coming. We've been told for decades a pandemic is coming. And it comes down to cooperation. It comes down to preparedness. It comes down to compassion. Sense. It comes down to organization on a local, state, federal, governmental, and organizational level. And that's something that we did not do terribly well this time. And we certainly didn't do well 100 years ago or 100.
Which gives little hope that we'll do it right 100 years from now.
Well, but the next pandemic might not take that much time. And I think that's the other bit that, people have a conversation about, that it's very, very possible that these pandemics have, we had SARS not too long ago. We've kind of seen more pandemics, but our response to pandemics really hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. And if anything, I remember reading a couple of articles from The Guardian where pandemic response in Africa was better than what was here in the United States because they've been fighting Ebola for so long. Like their whole community knows what happens. And if you're not wearing a mask, their police publicly shame you, grab you, throw you in a football stadium, and have someone teach you how to wear a mask. Like that is something that would never fly here in the United States.
No. And that's what they were doing in Italy. Police were out roaming the streets, yelling at people to get home. Yeah. At the start, when it was really bad in the spring of 2020 for them. But what's fascinating is that 10% of the world's population is immune to whatever the disease is, whether it's Ebola, whether it's AIDS, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's cancer. 10% of the global population would survive because they're just naturally immune to whatever it is, which is a fascinating statistic to me.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I know that they were doing some of that same research on plague. Once upon a time, they were actually doing on the village of Eyam in England, like why so many people who like chose to segregate themselves once the plague came, why 40% of their population survived. That because they found out genetically, they have a genetic code that makes them immune, or that their ancestors were immune to the plague. And it was cool because those are the same descendants who are immune to AIDS. They're immune to H1N1. They're immune. Again, it's super weird because now that we can kind of suss out that DNA, it's going to be really interesting to see where that direction goes. Like, I don't want to get Gattaca on anybody because we just had a huge, dropping a lot of knowledge. But another thing I kept thinking about too during your presentation is people asked us about nurses and nursing corps when we talk about a lot of World War I topics. And what people maybe didn't realize before is how women of color were barred from joining the Army, Navy, Marine nursing corps. And it wasn't until the flu pandemic where there's just a shortage of nurses that all of a sudden the government's like, okay, I guess we'll take women of color. Like sure, you can join us now when it's the most desperate.
Because, well, if they died, well, it's not our regular nursing corps.
Right. But you just couldn't get a nurse. Like you could not get, you just could not get nurses. We just could not get enough of them.
Philadelphia begged. Yeah.
People were begging and they're like, oh, you have a private nurse at home? Like, could you please lend them to us? And they're like, no, like, I want my private nurse. They're staying at home with me.
Yes, the Mellons, the Carnegies were being implored, please give us your private nurses.
Not happening.
A lot of teachers, when school closed, when the schools closed and the kids were out, a lot of those teachers turned right around and went and helped in hospitals as best they could. No training, we're available.
Right. And there was correspondence classes, and which is another record set at the National Archives in St. Louis National Personnel Record Center, is that they had the student nurses academic records. So that was free training. That was free training, free education. They're like, you don't have to pay. Like, we need nurses so badly. Here you go. But they kept all their academic records. So even if a woman didn't become a professional nurse after the war, they still kept all of their academic records. So you're actually able to see what people were studying in school, what they were good at. And a lot of what they were doing, a lot of it was caregiving and what we would consider almost hospice care in a way that, we're just trying to get people comfortable. We're, do what you can to get somebody comfortable, get them kind of reassured, this is what we need to do, and you move on to the next person. And it would not, it's hard because we can't pull those stats because those records aren't easily available online. You have to go to St. Louis to get them. But I would be really excited to see them and see them digitized, because then we could see precisely what some of the course material and kind of try to find the course material to see what people were learning in those classes and the difference between a correspondence course and an in-person course. I think that would be another one to kind of figure that out. But
that's what's a shame about Governor Loudon's records, is that their records don't exist for the emergency committee that he set up. So he declares it on September 25th, but at the state archives, there's nothing on that committee in his personal papers or in the papers donated to the archives after his death.
Yeah. So
there's no way to know who was on that committee, how active were those committees. In Sangamon County, they had 2 Red Cross hospitals that were set up, so they really dived in, and it did a fantastic job of taking care of the ill within Sangamon County. Not every county did that. Will County had set up a hospital at the the country club 3 miles outside of Joliet, and there was a nurse who was sent to Illinois from Connecticut or Massachusetts, who, when she finally went back home after the pandemic, wrote about it in her nursing journal, giving the stats, giving the number of people in Joliet who had died, because Will County didn't keep that number.
Yeah,
he started Will County.
We've had a lot of problems with Will County, just in general when it comes to research, but and that goes into a whole nother genealogical rant that we could probably do a whole nother Bob Hope, Danny Kaye show about. But the other thing that I was thinking too was how that the number of Red Cross chapters popped up, and you'll see during that time period from about some of them pop up a little earlier, 1917, maybe a little bit earlier, depending on if they're getting involved with the French wounded relief or the French orphans relief or something along those lines. You'll see some chapters kind of pop up a little earlier than that. But a lot of American Red Cross chapters pop up between 1917 and they go until about 1919, 1920. And the chapters, depending on the state would ask the local chapters to send a yearly report in, like this is what we did this year, and this is who was responsible for what. And even though I go through those, and even though people talk about we're showing people how to roll bandages, and we're showing people how to make masks, and we're, you know, showing children how to apply first aid. It's so strange because when I go through some of the reports, especially for states like North Carolina and Michigan, there's no real pandemic relief in those reports. So much of it is war effort reports. Like, this is the amount of money we raised for Liberty Loan. This is the amount of immigrants we taught citizenship classes for. This is the amount of children that we got into the Junior Red Cross. It's a very, very, it's not like, it almost feels like the pandemic really didn't exist. Yet, you know, historically, as a historian, like, aren't people seeing the black wreaths on their doors? Aren't people seeing the white wreaths on doors? Aren't people seeing that there aren't any caskets to buy? Like, you almost feel like, didn't people have this idea that, you know, oh crap, something's not right here? You know, like, it's this strange disconnect that, you know, I'm wondering if those things were submitted and then edited, or if those things were just, they were kind of told in their guidelines, because in their reports, they're told to like document everything that you do. But
I'm thinking it's got to be a separate set of collections that just didn't survive. I'm
Yeah.
thinking that had to have been a separate file and a separate folder that was kept specifically on that task, and it
Yeah.
just didn't file its way into the rest of their more mundane paperwork.
Yeah, because it's so weird, because women were being, you know, women were, the Red Cross were recruiting women for ambulance brigades, for police work, for nursing work, and women of, not only women of color, but women of Asian descent and Latinx backgrounds were starting their own Red Cross chapters. The chapters were segregated because that's how things were then, and that was perfectly acceptable at the time. But that was one of the primary ways that women could contribute, was through Red Cross chapters. But we're just, even though that is now being brought to light more than what we were seeing, even Tina, even just like what, 5 or 6 years ago, when we started getting really hardcore into this, we're seeing more of that documentation and hearing more of those stories. Where you and I, once upon a time, it seemed like we were the only two people on the planet doing World War I stuff, you know.
But we were talking about the only pandemic, and now look where we are.
Yeah, that's what, yeah, and it's so weird because, like, when I started seeing these things happen and we started seeing the shelter in place orders and stuff, and I'm like, people are like, oh, this is so horrible, and I'm like, dude, you do realize there was a whole nother, like, you guys do realize that there was a whole nother thing. And so it was.
See, I don't put this on par with 1918 in my mind, and
me neither.
Can take me to task for that. I would put it more in line with what was happening in 1957 or potentially in 1965 with the numbers that we're seeing, versus the global catastrophe that we had in 1918. But then again, like I said, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because our population was 2.5 billion then, and we're looking at 8 billion now. Those numbers are never going to match.
Right. And we're also seeing too that it's the same thing of record keeping. It's the same thing of which places are keeping accurate stats. And even without a national health service, which has been another issue that people have reported, in countries that have a national health service, their statistics, and their trace contacting is actually much higher. In the United States, with the patchwork of our healthcare system, and people not being able to self-report that I'm ill or I have these symptoms or vice versa, even just to keep those in line, you have to be truly sick and truly have symptoms and get a test. And there was months like where nobody could get them unless you met a certain criteria, or you were a certain age, or you had certain underlying health conditions. Like, we're still
our numbers in the spring were grossly underreported.
Oh, completely. And so we're still seeing that same pattern repeat itself again. And it's just so surreal to me. Like, sometimes I look around and I'm saying, like, Bill, did we really learn anything from this experiment? But as much as we had parallels, you know, Illinois, at least Chicago did better this time around. I mean, I think that might be up for negotiation, but Chicago did better this time around.
Arwadi is light years better than John Del Robertson. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I give her the utmost kudos and respect. But, you know, we see the same thing in 2020 that we saw in 1918, 1919. You're going to have some who rise to the challenge, and you're going to have some that completely flounder.
Yeah.
And it's not about necessarily pandemic response, it's about human response. Some people are just able to take charge and deal with it, and some people can't.
Right. Yeah, and you'll see the memes. I think this was like my last bit was the memes. Like, I don't know if anybody knows this, but you know, people around the time of 1918, 1919, and even earlier than that loved cat memes. They loved LOL cats. So like we think that we like have like watching cute cat pictures on YouTube is like a new thing. It's not. It actually goes back to the early ages of photography in the late 1870s, early 1880s, where people would dress cats up in like outfits and then take pictures of them. And people loved those LOL cats. It was like the best thing ever. Now it's just become more of a meme where people like try to come up with something pandemic related. And they were not necessarily doing the same thing, was more of a patriotic war postcard, you know, theme at the time. But you're just seeing this explosion. I think that's one thing people are going to take out of this pandemic is just the amount of memes. Like someone told me the other day, they said, they'll say, oh, grandpa, grandma, how did you make it through the pandemic of 2020? And somebody had, I don't know if anybody watches Game of Thrones, but they had Tyrion Lannister and Jon Snow walking around, and it's Tyrion Lannister saying, it was a long and bloody tale. Truth be told, I was drunk through most of it. And it makes sense because, you know, how did you get through the pandemic? Like, what did you do? And so much of our humor is that I wouldn't say gallows humor, but it's like that type of humor that, you know, well, we just dealt with it and it was a funny humor. And that's just the things that you do. Like all my coworkers, like everybody who has, oh, my coworkers at home, like your cat, your dog, your whoever, like my coworkers lick their butt and give me dirty looks while I'm working. You know, I think that people kind of took a lot of humor or made a lot of humor where we just don't see that out of that first pandemic that or the 1917 to 1920 pandemic. We didn't see that humor then. But I think part of it, I'm not sure how much of it is just because media's grown and because we don't have as much of that lockdown on media like we did previously, but also that media's changed and it's expanded and it's no longer just a newspaper or a postcard or a journal or something that's mailed to your house. Your media is something that, you know, you take your phone and you have the small magical computer in your pocket and you take it with you everywhere. But I know it's so weird to think about it. I mean, like, what was another one somebody told me the other day, and this is like my last one, but someone said, like, I never thought I would live to see such times. Like, we're not, you know, we're not even going to talk about what happened at the time of this recording. It's been a week since we had that protest, terrorist act, whatever you want to call it, at the Capitol. It's been now a week since then. And somebody asked me that. They're like, I've lived to see these times. And I kept thinking about one of my favorite films, which is Lord of the Rings. And I kept thinking of Gandalf because he's like, well, everybody thinks like that when they go through times like these, but it's not for us to judge. It's for us to do the best with what we have and with the time that we have. And that's kind of become my own personal mantra. And it's become a mantra of more than a couple of people that I know. It's just like, this is our times and we work through them and we deal with them and we learn from them and we hopefully pass that information on to others and keep them strong too. So it's a very strange times. It's very strange times we live in. I know. All right. Well, Tina, your presentation was awesome as usual. If there's anybody's actually watching this past the original lecture time, this is what Tina and I actually were just on the Zoom call for like almost 2 hours before we recorded this, just because we hadn't seen each other in a year. We have not seen each other in a year.
We've been doing our part. We've been staying home and staying safe.
Yeah. And doing a lot of research, doing a lot of
I'm
research.
Doing a lot of research.
I have. I've been doing a lot of research.
I've been doing a lot of doom scrolling. Look that up.
No, I broke through so many brick walls. I finished a couple book reviews. There's been a lot of different projects, but it's just been weird because not going anywhere doesn't mean that you can't be productive. But the one thing I did learn how to do, because I'm such a dork, is I started going through old World War I cookbooks because, you know, I love me an old World War I cookbook. So I started going through the ration cookbooks from World War I and making recipes out of a ration cookbook from World War I, which I love. And I get them for free off Internet Archive. And now I make a perfect 1-egg sponge cake, which I may just add to the bottom of this video. So people can give it a try. But it's perfect. It's delicious. And oh, like so proud of myself. Like
I'm jealous.
It's well, and I think you'd like this one because I made it. It was gluten-free. So yes, it's gluten-free with coconut sugar. It ticks all the boxes for you. So I'm very, very proud of myself. I might have to make you one and drop it off at your house and stand 80 feet away from your door and watch you with binoculars eating the cake that I made you.
As I come out, run out and get it and run back inside.
Yeah, you're just going to eat it so much that your cheeks just explode like a chipmunk. Be awesome. All right. Well, Tina, this has been a really great program. Thank you for your amazing lecture. Really love hearing all that you've learned, and thank you for sharing with us. This has been a very long history happy hour, and we hope that you were drinking adult beverages or your beverage of choice during our program. But Tina will be back with us next month for your program on the history of the Blackhawks.
Yeah, well, let me see. Can you see that? Blackhawks?
Oh yes, nice.
So we won't be talking about the history of the Blackhawks. We're going to be talking about how the Blackhawks got their name. So we're going to be talking about the owner of the Blackhawks and the end of the First World War and the Blackhawk Division. So I might throw a little Blackhawks history in there, you know, because, you know, born and raised, man, I got to represent. But it's largely going to be about how the Blackhawks came to be named the Blackhawks.
I love it. It's going to be a lot of fun. So that'll be for February's History Happy Hour. And we're super stoked that you were here. So we hope to see you next week. We look forward to hearing your comments, feedback. Please don't forget to contact Tina if you have any questions or you need help with anything. She's always happy. And we will see you next month. So stay safe, and we'll see you guys in just a couple of weeks.
All right, be well.
All right, be well.
Bye.